even in wanting to fixate on its specifically moral dimension. The comparison between the protagonists of the Grand Anti-Fascist Alliance certainly has its contrasts. But how to explain, then, the current Manichaean opposition? Let's return to the secular process behind the catastrophe that explodes with the collapse of the Tsarist autocracy. Sadly, while accepted when it comes to historical reconstruction, the long-term perspective disappears like magic when it comes to the formulation of a moral judgment. Everything is reduced to the demonization of the period that began with October 1917, and with Stalin in particular. Are those who for a long time supported a regime characterized by such violent social relations, and so violently dehumanizing that the catastrophe was foreseen by such different personalities, blameless? Is there nothing to censure in those who unleashed World War I, and that in the West, with the aim of forcing Russia to participate in it until the end, didn't hesitate in arming and propping up even the most ferocious reactionary groups? If, as sustained by one of the authors of the Black Book of Communism, Stalinism began taking form in 1914, why doesn't the bench for the accused have those that were responsible for the slaughter, but only those that sought to prevent or hasten its conclusion? At least with regard to the origin and the unfolding of the Second World War, the problematic character of the moral judgment to be formulated on the Western and liberal statesmen didn't go unnoticed by the more attentive authors. We saw two Canadian historians attribute to the British protagonists of appeasement, in truth, the redirection of Nazi expansionism to the East, shared responsibility for the tragedy of World War II, including Holocaust. Then there's the problem of how the war was conducted by the liberal West once it began. Of course, in this case as well the ruling ideology gets off easy. A successful historian and journalist, whose articles are also found in the New York Times, and who has very little doubts about the timing and moral righteousness of the use of the atomic bomb against Japan, goes as far as stating that to not use it would have been illogical and completely irresponsible. Certainly a massacre of an innocent civilian population took place, but those who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were victims not of American technology, but of a paralyzed system of government, devoted to a twisted ideology that had eliminated not only absolute moral values, but reason itself. 863 These firmly held certainties rest on a very simple assumption: the responsibility for a horrible action does not necessarily belong to the material author of that action. It's something that has been similarly argued by the leaders of the USSR, having obviously recognized the horrors that took place at crucial moments in the history of the country, but having attributed its responsibility to imperialist encirclement and the aggressive policies of the great capitalist powers. It must be noted, however, that the journalist-historian, who is published and praised by the most prominent press organizations, applies his criteria only to the liberal and Anglo-Saxon West. But to only apply a criteria to one's own side is the very definition of dogmatism at the theoretical level and its hypocrisy at the moral level. Fortunately, it's possible to hear less simplistic opinions on Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. An illustrious American philosopher, Michael Walzer, observes that, for the then victorious American side, to resort to the atomic bomb and to kill and terrorize civilians, without even attempting a real negotiation with the Japanese, were two crimes in one. Walzer reaches a similar conclusion with regard to the destruction of Dresden and other German and Japanese cities, carried out when the war had already been virtually won. 864 The question is put differently during the years in which the triumph of the Third Reich appeared to be taking place, when Great Britain begins its strategic bombing campaign that in Germany systematically and ruthlessly targets the civilian population. It's a tragic moment and the British rulers find themselves in a terrible moral dilemma that can be formulated as follows. Can soldiers and statesmen trample over the rights of innocent people to save their own political community? I would be inclined to respond in the affirmative to that question, although not without hesitation and concern. What other choice would be available to them? They can sacrifice themselves for the purpose of defending moral law, but they can't sacrifice their own countrymen. Faced with an endless and horrible situation, the options in front of them are exhausted. They will do what is necessary to save their own people. 865 The danger of a victory by the Third Reich, the personification of evil in the world, dictates a supreme emergency, a state of necessity, so it's then necessary to observe that necessity knows no limits. Certainly, bombing campaigns that aim to kill and terrorize the civilian population of an enemy country are a crime. However, I dare say that our history would be wiped out, our future put in jeopardy, if I didn't accept assuming the burden of the criminal act here and now. The young Lukacs makes a similar argument when, driven by the butchery of World War I, his revolutionary orientation matures. In affirming the inevitability of guilt and appealing to seriousness, consciousness, and a sense of moral responsibility, he exclaims, paraphrasing Hebel, "And if God, between me and the task that's been assigned to me, had placed sin, who am I to be allowed to escape that choice?" 866 Presumably later, with that same state of mind, as the threat posed by the Third Reich grows ever more imminent, the Hungarian philosopher faced the years of Stalin's terror. We can now turn our sights to the Soviet Union. It's worthwhile to observe the thesis formulated by Toynbee, according to which Stalingrad was made possible by the journey taken by Stalin's USSR from 1928 to 1941. 867 is today confirmed by no small number of historians and experts on military strategy. It's quite possible that, without the abandonment of the NEP, without the collectivization of agriculture and the rushed industrialization, with the development of the arms industry and with the rise of new industrial centers in the eastern regions, at a safe distance from the invading army, it would have been impossible to successfully oppose Hitler's aggression. The unequaled and incontestable contribution by Soviet Russia to the defeat of Nazi Germany is closely linked to the stubborn Second Revolution by Stalin. 868 Moreover, in Churchill's judgment, even the trial against Tukhachevsky and the Great Terror as a whole had played a positive and even an important role in the defeat of Operation Barbarossa. Must we then justify the concentrationary universe that made it possible to avoid a horror without end for the Soviet people and for all of humanity? Walzer rightly subjects his stated principle to rigorous conditions. It can only be considered valid if, aside from being truly rare and dire, the danger is also imminent. 869 One could possibly say that the second condition is absent in the Soviet Union. Stalin begins coerced collectivization of agriculture and rushed industrialization, which ends up provoking a horrible expansion of the concentrationary universe, when the threat of a war is still remote and Hitler hadn't even seized power. One could also argue in response that Great Britain also promoted its plan for the construction of an air fleet suited to future strategic bombing campaigns at least 2 decades before the rise of its supreme emergency. In fact, that plan began taking shape during the First World War and, therefore, what motivated it was the competition for hegemony underway since at least the end of the 19th century. The context is very different for the country that is born out of the October Revolution. Widespread in Europe at the time, the analysis offered by General Foch, among others, soon after the signing of the Versailles Treaty, "It's not a peace, it's but an armistice for 20 years." 870 is well known to Stalin, who warns about the urgency of the task of tackling the backwardness demonstrated by Russia during the First World War. With regard to the Eastern Front, that conflict was continuously understood by Wilhelm II as a racial war in which the very existence of the nations in battle was at stake, the to be or not to be of the Germanic race in Europe. It was a fight that excluded any reconciliation or mutual recognition. Peace is in no way possible between Slavs and Germans. Specifically starting with Brest-Litovsk, voices had emerged in Wilhelm's Reich that looked to the east in search of a solution for the problem of living space, and who had in mind an understanding with Britain with the aim of carrying out the dismemberment of Russia and creating the conditions for Germany's position in the world as an enormous continental power. 871. A few years later, in Mein Kampf, Hitler clearly described his program for the construction of a continental German empire to be built primarily over the ruins of the Soviet Union. It's not hard to identify the line that leads from Brest-Litovsk to Operation Barbarossa, and that's enough to explain Stalin's concerns. In any case, the imminence of the threat is anything but unambiguous. There's no great way of measuring its distance in time. The threat is imminent enough that no delays can be permitted for it to be adequately handled. Moreover, if we understand imminence not only with respect to time, but also with respect to location, the Soviet Union was clearly exposed to a more imminent threat. Lastly, while the systematic killing of a civilian population by aerial bombardment is a crime in itself, the collectivization of agricultural and rushed industrialization end up leading to a series of crimes. Those who only contemplate the moral dilemmas of the Anglo-Saxon statesman demonstrate dogmatism and hypocrisy. Yet, even if we affirm alongside Walzer that when faced with the supreme emergency a statesman must know how to assume the burden of the crime here and now, it becomes difficult to move on from the general to the particular. When we read about the terrible suffering individuals held in the Gulag went through, disturbed by a horrible experience of which they are unable to comprehend either its origin or its reason, we are led to exclaim alongside Petrarch povera et nuda vi philosophia. But a similar consideration holds true for the victims of strategic bombing campaigns. Can the supreme emergency really justify that which is described in written accounts? The first round of bombs fell at 9 in the morning on streets full of people lined up to shop, and it killed 700 people, nearly all of them women and children. Later the warplanes pursued and struck the citizens fleeing to the east, to the forest. In other places the warplanes started strafing pedestrians, cyclists, train passengers, farmers working in the fields. The funerals take place under low-altitude attacks. Lacking coffins, bed sheets were used. The bombs smashed through houses, remaining stuck in the ceiling. They explode 10 days later, during the light of day or in the dark of night. They knock down walls, and kill residents while they sleep. People had to flee through the flames and thereby rush to their deaths. There were even those who took their own lives or threw themselves into the flames. 872 In any case, criminal at a time when the defeat of the Third Reich was already becoming evident, are these actions justified while the supreme emergency is in effect? It's once again evident the difficulty in moving from the general to the particular.